She had counted the tiles before. 53. Cold marble, pale as old bone, running from the great doors of the throne hall to the foot of the dais where he sat. She had walked that distance twice before, once on the day she first arrived at the palace, nervous and trying not to show it, and once on the day he had asked her to stay. Today was the third time. She counted again because it was something to do with her eyes, something to keep them from going to his face. 41. 42. The High Steward's voice filled the hall the way smoke fills a room, slowly, then everywhere. Sarah Voss, Omega of no registered bloodline, is hereby released from the Alpha King's service and escorted from the palace grounds by nightfall. 43. 44. She had rehearsed, telling him 18 times on the walk down this very corridor. She had decided to do it at the banquet tonight. In front of the court, the nobles, the guards, not because she wanted an audience, but because she had thought, stupidly, that witnesses might matter, that a room full of people would make it harder for anyone to pretend afterward that the moment hadn't happened. She was 4 weeks along. She had known for 6 days. 45. The guards were already moving toward her from the sides of the hall. Not roughly. That was almost worse. The professionalism of it. The practiced politeness. As if this were simply a logistical matter. A schedule to be cleared. She stopped counting tiles. She looked up. Not at the guards. Not at the steward, still reading from his scroll with the practiced boredom of a man who had read too many decrees to feel any of them. Not at the court, assembled on either side of the long hall, the lords and ladies who had made a study of looking away at precisely the right moments. She looked at him. Aldrich. He sat on the throne, the way he sat in every room, like he had decided where he would be before he arrived there, like the space arranged itself around him rather than the other way around. His hands were flat on the armrests. His jaw was set. He was not looking at her. That was the thing she would carry out of this room, not the decree, not the word released, which sat in her chest now like a swallowed stone, not the guard's footsteps or the rustle of silk from the assembled court, or the way the light came through the high windows and made everything look important and cold. The fact that he didn't look. She left before the guards reached her. She did not run. She walked, 11 tiles back the way she had come, then through the side door, then down the servants' corridor, then out a back passage that led on to the eastern courtyard. She had learned the palace's bones in her time here, the hidden joints of it, which doors stuck, which guards rotated at what hour. She had learned it the way she learned everything, quietly, on her own, because knowing things had always felt safer than needing them. The courtyard was empty. She stood in it for a moment. The sky above was that particular shade of pale gray that winter does in the north. Not quite clouds, not quite clear, just a flat refusal of color. The fountain in the center had been drained for the cold season. The basin was dry and full of dead leaves. She looked at the leaves for a while. Then she went to collect her things. She had one bag. She had always had one bag. She had come to the palace with it, kept it packed out of habit, some deeply practical part of her that had never quite believed this was permanent. Her grandmother had taught her that. Keep what matters close. Keep it in one place. Be ready to move. Her grandmother had survived 3 pack wars and 2 famines by being impossible to surprise. Sarah packed her bag in 11 minutes. She took the servants' exit, the one that opened onto the lane behind the stables, and she walked north. She did not look back at the palace. She had a rule about that. The first night she slept in a barn. The farmer who owned it didn't say anything when she knocked and asked. He looked at her for a moment, at her pack, at the set of her jaw, at whatever it is that people see when they look at a woman walking alone in winter. And he nodded and pointed at the barn and went back inside. She lay in the hay and stared at the ceiling and did not think about Aldrich. She thought about the hay instead. The smell of it, the particular way it poked through her cloak, the sounds the horses made in the next stall, deep, rhythmic breathing, occasional shifts of weight, the soft knock of a hoof against wood. She did not think about Aldrich. She pressed her hand flat against her abdomen in the dark. She had been doing this since she found out. A reflex, like checking that something was still in your pocket. It wasn't something she had decided to do. Her hand just went there. She lay like that for a long time. Outside, the wind moved across the fields and made the barn roof creak. She slept. 3 days of walking. The road going north was not much of a road, more of a long argument between gravel and mud, neither one winning. She passed 2 villages, a waypost with a broken roof, and a dead tree that had fallen across the path, and that everyone had apparently decided to walk around rather than remove. She walked around it too. Rogue territory began where the last pack marker ended, a carved post half buried in frost, the sigil worn down to almost nothing by weather and years. There was no wall, no gate, just the absence of any obligation on either side. Omegas without pack ties were not technically illegal in the rogue territories. They were just nobody's problem. That was fine. She was used to being her own problem. She had 2 dried meat strips left, a heel of hard bread, and enough coin sewn into the lining of her cloak to last 3 weeks if she was careful. She was always careful. She had been careful about everything her whole life, and she had still ended up here, 4 weeks pregnant, walking alone through frozen farmland. So perhaps careful was not the protection she had always assumed it to be. She ate half a meat strip and kept walking. Marin's cottage was not hard to find if you knew where to look, which required knowing where not to look first. It sat at the end of a track that didn't appear on any map she had ever seen, behind a stand of birches that managed to look perfectly ordinary from every direction except the correct one. There was smoke coming from the chimney. There was a string of dried herbs hanging above the door, the kind that smelled like something between a garden and an argument. Sarah knocked. The door opened before her knuckles finished the second rap. Marin was a small woman who gave the impression of being considerably larger than her actual size, in the way that very certain people do. She had iron-gray hair, eyes that catalogued everything they touched, and the expression of someone who had seen a great deal of the world and had not been particularly impressed by most of it. She looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at her. "You look," Marin said, "like a woman who figured out she was about to make a serious mistake." She stepped back from the door. "An invitation. And then made it anyway," she added. Sarah walked in. The cottage was warm in the way that buildings are warm when they have been loved for a long time. Not just heated, but inhabited, layered with the particular warmth of years of fires and meals, and people who stayed. There were plants everywhere. On the sills, hanging from the rafters, ranked on shelves in clay pots of varying sizes. There were stacks of books with broken spines. There was a kettle already on the hook above the fire, which told Sarah that either Marin had been expecting her, or Marin was the sort of person who always had a kettle on, which seemed equally likely. Marin pulled out a chair. Sarah sat. She did not say anything for a moment. She had not actually spoken to another person in 3 days, and she had forgotten how to start. "Tea first," Marin said, "then whatever you're carrying." That turned out to be easier. The tea was some kind of dark, sharp thing that smelled like the inside of a forest. Sarah drank it and felt it unpack something in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. Marin asked questions the way a healer asks questions. Not gently, not harshly, just with precision. Symptoms, weeks, physical changes, sleep, appetite. She took notes on a small piece of parchment with a stub of charcoal. She didn't ask who the father was. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask where Sarah was going, or how she had ended up at a door in the middle of rogue territory, half frozen, with the specific kind of hollow look that comes from holding something very heavy for several days without putting it down. At the end of it, she reviewed her notes. She looked up. "There are 2, she said. The fire crackled. Sarah looked at her tea. She pressed her thumbnail into the chip on the rim of the cup, a small crescent of missing glaze on the right side, rough against her nail. She pressed it. Let go. Pressed it again. 2. "Are you certain?" she said. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Marin said. "I'm certain." The cup was full. She hadn't drunk any of it. She had forgotten she was holding it. 2. She pressed the chip again. Outside, the wind moved through the birches, and the sound it made was nothing like anything, and she sat with that for a long time. She stayed. There was no dramatic decision to it. She had nowhere else to go, and Marin had a spare room with a cot and a window that looked out at the birch stand, and she did not ask Sarah to leave. So Sarah stayed. She paid in labor. She was not good at doing nothing. Her grandmother had cured her of that by age 7, and so she helped with the herb garden, with the drying and sorting and grinding, with the fires, with the trips to the nearby stream for water. She was not a healer, had never trained for it, but her hands were useful and she could follow instructions, and she didn't ask questions she hadn't earned the answer to yet. Marin seemed to appreciate all of this. She expressed appreciation the way some people do, by simply continuing to not ask you to leave. They worked alongside each other. They ate together. They talked about plants. Occasionally they talked about other things. Marin had been expelled from the capital 3 years ago. She did not say this outright. She said it the way she said most things. Obliquely, through reference, in the way that people talk about things they have made a certain peace with. She had treated a rogue female the court had condemned for an unregistered pregnancy. Quietly, without ceremony, the way important verdicts are always delivered. One day she was in the capital. The next she wasn't. "Did you fight it?" Sarah asked. Marin considered this. "I treated the patient," she said. "That was the fight." They went back to grinding dried lavender. Winter softened into the slow gray season that comes before spring, when the frost is mostly gone but the warmth hasn't committed yet. Sarah's cloak stopped being necessary in the afternoons. The birches began doing something tentative with their buds. She was 12 weeks along. Then 16, then 20. She learned which roots were safe and which ones weren't, which she had not known before and which seemed, in retrospect, like something she should have learned before. She learned that willow bark brewed light was useful for back pain and that it was going to become her most frequent companion over the next several months. She learned that certain herbal combinations could ease morning sickness, and that Marin had developed most of these combinations herself over 30 years of practice and wrote nothing down because she kept it all in her head, which seemed like an impossible organizational system until Sarah realized that Marin simply never forgot anything she'd decided to keep. She began to understand why people came to Marin from 3 territories over. She also began to understand why Marin had stayed after the exile. The cottage had a quality to it, a particular kind of stillness in the evenings, the light coming through the herb-lined windows in long gold bars, the smell of whatever was drying above the fire, that felt like the opposite of the palace. The palace had been all surface, every room performing its own importance. Even the private rooms, even the rooms she had thought were just for them, had been watched somehow, had carried the weight of being inside something that was always being recorded and assessed. Here, nothing was being recorded. She thought about that. She let herself think about it. The letter came on a Tuesday. She knew it was his before she saw the seal, some recognition that traveled faster than thinking, which she resented. The courier was a young man who had clearly been traveling for some time and who handed it over without meeting her eyes, which meant he'd been told who she was or had guessed. She thanked him and gave him bread and sent him on his way. She put the letter on the table. She went outside and pulled weeds in the herb garden for 2 hours. She came back in. The letter was still on the table. She made dinner. She and Marin ate. They talked about the southerly winds that had been coming in odd, possibly a sign of an early spring, possibly nothing, the weather in the territories being notoriously unreliable. The letter sat on the table. She washed the dishes. Marin, who had not once looked at the letter and had not once asked about it, said good night and went to her room. Sarah sat with the letter for a while. On the 5th day she moved it from the table to the shelf. On the 7th morning, before the fire was properly going and before Marin was awake, she took it down. She opened it. The paper was heavier than it needed to be. He had always used paper that cost more than it should have. She had noticed that early, one of those small details you file away without meaning to. The handwriting was his. She would have known it anywhere. Angular, spare. The letters of a man who had learned to write late and had never trusted the process, who put each word down like he was making a commitment. There are things you were not told. I need you to understand that they were not mine to tell. That was all. No explanation, no apology, no name, no date, No closing. She read it 3 times. She folded it exactly as it had come, pressing the crease with her thumbnail until the fold was sharp. She put it in her pocket. "He sent a letter," she told Maren over breakfast. "I know," Maren said. "It doesn't say anything. They never do." Maren split a piece of bread. "That's not the same as meaning nothing." Sarah looked out the window. The birches were doing something slightly more committed with their buds this morning. Autumn arrived the way it always does. Not with any announcement. Just one morning the light was a different color and the air smelled like something ending. She was in the middle of folding a set of dried chamomile when it happened. A push, against the inside of her ribs. Sharp. Specific. Like someone tapping to be let in. She stopped moving. She waited. It happened again. The other side this time. She stood in the middle of Maren's kitchen with her hands full of chamomile and her chest doing something she had no immediate language for, and she waited. She could hear the fire. She could hear Maren outside, moving around the garden. She pressed one hand to her left side, one to her right, 2 separate beats of motion, back and forth, like a conversation she wasn't part of yet. She stood there for a long time. The chamomile went slightly limp in the heat of her hands. She didn't notice. She didn't tell Maren. Not that day. She had this idea, not quite formed, that if she said it out loud it would become something different than what it was right now, in this moment, which was just hers, just something that was happening between her and the inside of her own body, quiet and enormous, and not yet requiring any response from the wider world. She told Maren 3 days later. Maren said, "I know." The birth was in late autumn, which Maren said was good. Cooler air, easier recovery. This turned out to be true, in the sense that all broadly accurate statements about difficult things are true. Not wrong, but insufficient. It was long. It was hard. There was a specific point, several hours in, when she was beyond the point of politeness or composure or anything except pure function, where Maren said, in a voice with no soft edges at all, "Don't you dare give up on me now." And she didn't, partly because she wasn't built for it, and partly because Maren was scary when she used that voice. A boy, a girl. Maren cleaned them up and handed them over, first one and then the other, and Sarah held one in each arm and felt the weight of them, actual physical weight, 2 small separate weights, symmetrical and warm. She looked at their faces. They had his eyes, both of them. That particular shade of gray that she had spent considerable mental energy trying not to think about for several months. She looked at them for a long time. She thought about the throne room, the 53 tiles, the way the decree had sounded, reading out her name like it was a minor administrative entry. She thought about the corridor she had walked alone, the barn, the frozen road, the letter with its single inadequate sentence. She thought about all of it, and she looked at these 2 faces, and then she said, very quietly, not to Maren, not to anyone, "We're going to be fine." Maren, who had her back turned and was doing something with the towels, nodded at the wall. Winter came back around and the twins began to have opinions. The girl had opinions about everything, about light, about sound, about whether the blanket was positioned correctly, about whether she was being looked at with the right degree of attention. She expressed these opinions loudly and with considerable specificity. She had been doing this since approximately 2 days after birth and showed no signs of stopping. The boy was different. He watched. He turned his head toward sound and tracked it with his eyes, with the patience of something that understood more than it was letting on. He would go very still sometimes and just look at her, which was deeply unnerving in the specific way that babies can be unnerving when they appear to be processing more information than their age reasonably allows. He had his father's quality of taking up space without movement. She noticed that and then tried to stop noticing it. She didn't entirely succeed. She learned things in those winter months that no one had warned her about. She learned how to sleep in short pieces and wake completely without the transition. She learned that it was possible to do almost anything with one hand if the other was occupied. She learned that she was capable of a rage so fast and total that it didn't feel like emotion at all. It felt like weather. Whenever either child made a sound she couldn't immediately locate and address. She also learned that there was a version of afraid that was not about herself. She had been afraid before, of plenty of things, at various points in her life, but that fear had always had at the center of it some version of what happens to me. This was different. This was a fear that had no self in it at all. It was just them, just keep them, just that ancient, unreasonable, completely non-negotiable requirement that these two specific people continue to exist and be well. It surprised her how absolute it was. She did not mention this to Maren, who probably knew already. Spring again. The twins were 4 months old. The girl had recently discovered her own hands, which had upgraded her opinions considerably. The boy had started making a sound that was not quite a word, but was clearly meant to be heading in that direction. Maren had 2 visitors from the capital, older women, retired from court service, who came every few months for supplies and gossip. They stayed for dinner. They were warm, comfortable women who had the ease of people who had watched a great deal of history happen and had survived it by being peripheral to it. They talked. Maren talked. The fire was good. The dinner was good. One of them said something about the Queen's chambers, the old Queen's chambers, Aldrich's mother's rooms, which had been sealed since her death 12 years ago. She was telling a story about her years in the palace, something about a door that stuck, and a maid who was always getting blamed for it, and she mentioned in passing that the passage behind the herbalist's quarters had been used to carry supplies to the sealed wing because the main corridors were too visible, and the Queen had not wanted the court to see how frequently she needed the healers in her last years. It was a small detail, one sentence in a longer story. Sarah set down her cup. Something in her mind went very still. She listened to the rest of dinner without hearing most of it. She answered when spoken to. She laughed in the right places. She nursed the girl, who had opinions about the timing, and transferred her to Maren's arms without drama. After the visitors left, she helped clear the table. She washed the dishes. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and felt something arranging itself in her head, pieces that had been separate clicking toward each other. The letter, things you were not told, the decree, the steward's voice, the way Aldrich had not looked at her, the passage behind the herbalist's quarters. She lay awake until the sky outside her window went from black to the dark blue that comes before gray. In the morning, she asked Maren directly. Maren set down the bowl she had been washing. She dried her hands on the cloth hanging from the hook by the basin. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer, but the quiet of someone deciding where to start. There is a staircase, she said, in the old wing of the palace, behind where the herbalist's quarters used to be, before they moved the stores. It leads down to the record room, the one the court uses for births, bloodlines, registrations, succession documents. You know this room. I've seen most rooms. It's an occupational habit. She turned back to the basin but didn't pick up the bowl. I also know that it contains the original copies of every decree issued under the current reign, including the ones that were changed. The kitchen was very quiet. Changed, Sarah said, altered, between the signing and the reading. Maren's voice was careful and flat, the voice she used when she was being precise. It happens. It has happened before. The steward's office sits between the Alpha King's signing chamber and the throne hall, and documents pass through it on their way from one to the other, and sometimes, she paused, sometimes they don't arrive unchanged. Sarah thought about the 53 tiles. She thought about the way the decree had sounded, the specific word, released, like something being put down, like something that had been held and was now not worth the holding. Whose hand was it? She said. Maren didn't answer, which was its own answer. The steward, Sarah said. The council, Maren said, which was more specific and more damning. The bowl sat in the soapy water. Neither of them reached for it. He signed a different document, Sarah said, not a question, according to what I have been told by people who were in positions to know. And the letter, he found out 3 weeks after you left, from what I understand. Maren finally picked up the bowl. He has not taken action against the council publicly because he does not yet have proof he can use. Proof that cannot be buried the way they buried the original decree. The record room, Sarah said. The record room, Maren agreed. She left the twins with Marin. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, and she did not permit herself to think about it in those terms, because thinking about it that way would make it impossible, and she needed it to be possible. She packed a single bag, the same bag, the one she had packed in 11 minutes in the palace, the one she had never unpacked, and she fed them both and held them both, and then she handed them to Marin, and she walked out of the cottage before she could do the other thing that was trying to happen in her chest. She didn't look back. She had a rule. The road south was different in spring. Longer somehow in the way that roads going toward things feel longer than roads going away from them. She walked for 4 days. She ate. She slept in a way station that had been repaired since she'd last passed it, which felt like a small, inexplicable piece of good news. On the 4th day she stood at the palace gates. She said her name. The guard went rigid. He sent a runner without being asked. He did not make her wait outside. He opened the gate and stood aside and directed her to a waiting room just inside the eastern entrance. A small stone room that smelled of cold ash and old wood, with a bench along one wall and a window too narrow to be useful. She sat on the bench. She set her bag on the floor. She waited. The door opened. Aldrich filled the frame the way certain presences fill spaces. Not dramatically, not with effort, just with the simple fact of his being there, which rearranged the available air and light before he'd even taken a step. He was wearing plain clothes, not throne room clothes. Work clothes, essentially. Dark, practical, the kind of thing you wore when you weren't expecting to be in a room that required anything of you. He had clearly been in the middle of something. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, the full weight of it, no looking away. She had forgotten, or had made herself forget. It was hard to tell the difference, what it was like to have his full attention. The complete, undivided quality of it, as if the rest of the world had simply stepped back to wait its turn. It was extremely irritating. "You came back," he said. "I came for answers," she said. "Don't read into it." He was quiet for a moment. She kept her face level. "I heard," he said carefully, "from Marin. There's a staircase," she said. "In the old wing. I need to see what's in the record room." Something moved across his face. Fast. She couldn't name it. "I know what's in it," he said. "Then you'll take me." It wasn't a question. She waited to see if he'd treat it like one. He didn't. He stepped back from the doorway. The palace was the same, and she was different, which was a specific kind of disorientation she hadn't prepared for adequately. The corridors were the same width, the same gray stone, the same cold light through the same tall windows, but she moved through them differently now, not as someone living here, not as someone who had spent months learning the bones of the place and feeling something complicated about those months. She moved through it like a woman who had something to find. Aldrich walked beside her, not behind, not in front. They did not speak. The old wing was toward the back of the palace, past the sections that were used regularly, through a corridor that still had the slightly musty quality of spaces that are maintained but not inhabited. The herbalist's quarters were a set of rooms now used for storage. She could see the stacked shelves through the open door as they passed. Beyond them, at the end of the corridor, there was a door she would have thought was a cupboard. Aldrich pressed a point on the wall beside it. The door swung inward. Beyond it, a staircase, stone, narrow, going down. There were iron sconces at intervals, with oil lamps already lit. He had been here recently, or someone had been here on his instruction. Either way, the lamps were warm, which meant someone had expected her to want to come here. She thought about that and went down the stairs. The record room was smaller than she'd expected. Stone floor, low ceiling, wooden shelving covering 3 walls, floor to ceiling, packed with bound folios of varying thickness and age. There was a table in the center, a single chair. The room smelled like paper and time. Aldrich went directly to a shelf on the left wall. He didn't hesitate. He had the particular knowledge of someone who had been here, and had stood in front of this exact shelf, and had taken down this exact folio before, and had read it, and had decided what to do with what it contained. He set it on the table. He opened it. He stepped back. She came forward and read. It took her a moment. The document was formal, dense. The language of official decrees was its own particular dialect. full of whereforeses and herebys, and references to statutes she didn't know. But the structure was clear enough, once she understood what she was looking at. There were two documents, side by side, mounted on facing pages. One was signed, Aldrich's signature at the bottom. She knew it, that angular scrawl, the same handwriting as the letter. The signed document was a betrothal restriction order, a legal measure preventing the court from initiating any formal betrothal proceedings for a period of 6 months. A protection, essentially, of a space that existed between the king and someone he had not yet formally bound. A protection of her space. While he figured out how to do it correctly, while he navigated whatever the court required. The second document was the decree she had heard read in the throne hall, released from service, escorted from the grounds. By nightfall, the same seal, different handwriting, not Aldrich's. She looked at the handwriting for a while. She looked at the seal. She knew the steward's signature from years of paperwork crossing her desk in her role at the palace. She had signed things he had signed. She had sorted documents that bore his mark. She recognized it without needing to be told. She looked up. Aldrich was standing on the other side of the table. He was looking at her. He had been looking at her since she started reading. He had the stillness of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time and was not going to rush it now that it was here. "You found out 3 weeks after I left," she said. "Yes." And the letter was inadequate. He said it the way he said things he had already arrived at and accepted. "I know." She looked back at the documents, the 2 signatures, the gap between what he had intended and what had been delivered in his name. "You didn't look at me," she said. "In the throne room. You didn't look." The silence that followed was different from his other silences. It had a different weight, lower, like something that had been pressed down for a long time. "I knew something was wrong," he said. "I didn't know what. I hadn't been told until that moment that the decree was being read. It was on the schedule, as a routine procedural matter, which was how they got it through without my—" He stopped, started over. "When I heard your name, I knew, but if I had looked at you, I would have—" He stopped again. The room was quiet. The lamp nearest the door was doing something slight with its flame, a small restless movement, not quite a flicker. "Would have what?" she said. He looked at the table, at his own hands, flat against the edge of the table, the way they had been flat against the armrests of the throne, that same quality of controlled stillness. "Stopped it," he said, and made a scene that would have confirmed every accusation the council had already prepared, which would have ended with the same outcome, except more witnessed, except messier. A pause. "I thought if I didn't react, if I let the room believe I had agreed to it, I could move quietly. Find the proof, bring you back without the council having legal standing to interfere." "You thought wrong," she said. "Yes." He didn't soften it or apologize for it. "I did." She closed the folio. She pressed her hand flat against the cover. She thought about the 53 tiles. She thought about the barn and the frozen road, and the letter, and the birch trees, and Marin's kitchen, and the weight of 2 small bodies in her arms, and the sound of a heartbeat she had not been able to stop herself from memorizing, even when she was trying very hard not to carry anything she wasn't required to carry. She thought about all of it. She lifted her hand from the folio. "There's a lot still to answer for," she said. "Yes. The council. I've already begun. I don't mean legally," she said. "I mean to me." He met her eyes. The silence did something different this time, opened instead of closing. "Yes," he said, differently. She told him about the twins in the anteroom with the cold ash smell. She did it the same way she did most important things, simply, plainly, without decoration. She said there were 2. She said they were 4 months old. She said their names. She watched his face. He went very still, stiller than his usual still, which was already considerable. His hands, which had been at his sides, moved slightly, not toward her, just a shift, a small involuntary motion like a body adjusting to new weight. "A boy and a girl," she said. He nodded. He was looking at a point somewhere between her face and the floor, not unfocused but inward, the way a person looks when they are trying to process something that is too large to fit in one moment and are doing the honest work of making space for it. They have your eyes, she said. Something happened in his expression then. She didn't have a name for it. She didn't try to name it. Where are they? He said. His voice was careful. Not cold. Careful. There was a difference. Safe. I want. He stopped. Began again. I would like to meet them, if you allow it. If you allow it. She turned the phrase over. She had expected demands. She had prepared herself for demands. Had been prepared, in fact, since she left the cottage, for the version of this conversation in which he was the Alpha King and she was the Omega of no registered bloodline, and the palace was the palace, and those things meant what they had always meant. The qualifier was not what she had prepared for. There's still a lot unresolved, she said. I know. The council members who did this, I'll deal with them. Not for me, she said. For you, for the record, for whatever you need politically, but not to make a point to me. I'm going to need you to understand the difference. He was quiet for a moment. I understand the difference, he said. She studied his face. She had spent a considerable amount of time over the past year trying not to think about his face, about the particular quality it had when he was saying something he meant, without the surrounding language that usually insulated people from the full weight of meaning. He didn't have that insulation, he never had. It was one of the things that had complicated everything from the beginning. Marin's cottage is 4 days east, she said. She stood. She picked up her bag. If you come quietly. The girl is sensitive to loud presences. She walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. She did not look back. She had a rule about that, but she could hear him breathing. Steady. Present. In the same room, in the same air, in the particular quiet of someone who had stopped filling a silence because the silence had become something worth keeping for a moment. She walked out. The corridor was the same gray stone, the same cold light. She put one foot in front of the other. The palace fell away behind her. She walked. The road east was long, and the spring air carried something sweet in it that the northern roads didn't usually have. She stopped once, outside a village, and sat on the low stone wall at the edge of a field and let the sun do what it was doing with the back of her neck. She thought about the record room, the two documents side by side, what he had signed and what had been delivered in his name. She thought about how simple the corruption had been, really, how bureaucratic, how small the gap between one man's intention and another man's act, and how enormous the distance a person could travel in that gap. She had walked 53 tiles, then 3 days of road, then 4 days north, then an entire year, the barn, the frozen farmland, the birches, Marin's kitchen, the smell of herbs and the weight of a cup, and the tap-tap from the inside of her ribs, and 2 gray-eyed faces that looked at her like she was the whole of what they knew. All of it in the space of one altered document. She sat on the wall for a while. Then she got up. She had 4 days east and 2 people waiting who had opinions about timing. She walked. She arrived at the cottage at dusk, 4 days later. The birches caught the last of the light in a way that made them look like something out of a story. Pale and still and improbably beautiful. The smoke was coming from the chimney. There was a lamp in the window. She knocked once. Marin opened the door. From somewhere inside came a sound. The specific, declarative sound of someone small who had decided that whoever had just knocked on the door had better be worth waiting for. They've been asking about you, Marin said, in their way. Sarah walked in. The girl saw her from across the room and did the thing she had recently learned to do. A whole body leaned forward, arms extended, the absolute physical demand of now, immediately, you, yes you, come here. And Sarah crossed the room and picked her up and held her, and breathed in the smell of her hair, which was the smell of everything that mattered. The boy watched from Marin's arms. When Sarah looked at him, he gave her the look, that steady, knowing, deeply unnerving look that had been his from the beginning. And then he did something he had never done before. He smiled. Just that, small, specific, a recognition. She held both of them and stood in Marin's kitchen while the lamp made shadows on the walls, and outside the birches held the last of the light, and the fire was doing something good behind the grate, and she did not think about tiles, or decrees, or altered documents, or the sound of a voice in a corridor, or everything that was still unresolved and would take a long time and could not be rushed. She thought about the weight in her arms, 2 separate small weights, and she thought, we are fine, not going to be fine, not someday fine, fine now, in this room, with this lamp, with these 2 faces that had her stubbornness and his eyes and their own particular way of being, entirely themselves. That was enough. For right now, it was enough. He arrived 6 days later, quietly, as requested, on foot, with a small escort that he left at the end of the track, which told her he had understood the instruction. She opened the door before he reached it. He stopped when he saw her, just for a moment. That small adjustment, like a large presence deciding what scale to exist at. Then he looked past her, into the cottage. The girl was on the floor. She had discovered recently that rolling was a method of transportation and was using it to travel toward a wooden spoon that had fallen off the table earlier. The boy was sitting up. He had gotten very good at sitting up, watching his sister's progress with the expression of a small person considering whether to assist or simply observe. Aldrich looked at them. He was very still. Sarah stepped aside from the door. He walked in. He went to the floor, not to his knees dramatically, not with any performance of the moment. Just sat down on the floor the way you sit down when you want to be at the right level. Unhurried, deliberate. The boy looked at him. The boy looked at him for a long, considering moment, in the way he looked at everything that required assessment. Then he made his sound, not quite a word, but clearly heading somewhere, and leaned forward. Something moved across Aldrich's face. She didn't look away from it. She let it be on her face, too, whatever it was. The complicated thing, the thing that was still unresolved and would take time and required more than one conversation in a room with cold ash. The thing that was also, underneath all of that, simpler than any of the complicated stuff. The simple fact of being here, in this room, the 4 of them. She sat on the bench by the door and watched. The girl had reached the wooden spoon. She picked it up with enormous satisfaction and immediately put it in her mouth. The boy reached toward his father. Outside, the birches caught the late afternoon light in their particular way. The lamp in the window was on. The fire was going. It was not a beginning. It was too far in to be a beginning. It was something further along the road than that. A moment after the hardest part, before the next hard part, in the breathing space between. She pressed her thumbnail against nothing. Old reflex. Then she let her hand rest flat on her knee. She sat with the quiet. It was enough.